It was just another busy morning at the bustling corporate office of a well-known company in the heart of the city. People rushed in and out of meetings, phones rang off the hook, and the sound of keyboards clicking filled the air. Among the chaos stood Michelle, a diligent and hard-working employee who had earned the respect of her peers through years of dedication and perseverance. She was known for her sharp intellect, unyielding work ethic, and a kindness that made her a favorite among her colleagues. But for reasons beyond her control, her efforts were never enough for one person, her boss, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards was the kind of person who carried himself with an air of superiority that often made people uncomfortable. He had an old-school mentality, a sharp tongue, and an undeniable bias he barely bothered to hide. For months, Michelle had endured his subtle jabs and overt dismissiveness. She brushed it off, telling herself that her work would eventually speak for itself. But the tension in the office had been building, and everyone knew it. The way Mr. Edwards treated Michelle wasn't just unfair, it was personal. It all came to a head on a particularly stressful Monday morning. A project deadline loomed, and the pressure was palpable. Michelle had stayed late every night the past week to ensure her part of the project was flawless. She knew how critical this presentation was for the company, and she wasn't about to let anyone down. But when the meeting began, and it was her turn to speak, Mr. Edwards interrupted her before she could even finish her first sentence. His tone was harsh, his words dismissive, and his criticism stung in front of everyone. Later that day, Michelle was called into Mr. Edwards' office. He wasted no time getting to the point. "This isn't working out," he said coldly. "Your performance has been subpar, and I can't have that kind of mediocrity dragging this team down." Michelle was stunned. Subpar? Mediocrity? She had poured her heart and soul into her work, and the results were evident. But arguing felt pointless. It was clear that his mind was made up. And the decision wasn't based on her work. As she walked out of the office with a heavy heart, carrying the box of her belongings, her colleagues watched silently. Some gave her sympathetic looks, while others whispered amongst themselves. Michelle kept her head high, her steps steady, but inside, she was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, hurt, and confusion swirled as she wondered what she could have done differently. What Mr. Edwards didn't know, however, was that Michelle's life outside of work was nothing like he imagined. She wasn't just any employee, she had a support system stronger than he could ever comprehend. Her husband, a figure of quiet strength and unparalleled influence, had always been her rock. And when she walked through the door that evening, tears streaming down her face, he immediately knew something was wrong. "Michelle, what happened?" he asked gently, his voice full of concern. She hesitated, unsure how to put her feelings into words. But as she recounted the events of the day, her husband's expression shifted from concern to quiet determination. "This isn't over," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. What Michelle didn't realize was that her husband's next move would not only change the course of her career but also send shockwaves through the entire company. Mr. Edwards had underestimated her, and more importantly, he had no idea who her husband really was. As the wheels were set in motion, the question lingered, what happens when you cross the wrong person without knowing their power? Stay tuned, because what unfolds next will leave you questioning how far respect and fairness can truly go in the face of unchecked prejudice. Michelle's husband, Daniel, was a man of calm confidence and quiet authority. He wasn't the kind of person who needed to raise his voice to command attention, his mere presence was enough. He worked in a world far removed from the corporate chaos Michelle had endured, but his influence was undeniable. Daniel had built his career on fairness and integrity, values that he held close to his heart. It was why Michelle's story hit him so hard. Hearing how she had been treated wasn't just an insult to her, it was an affront to everything he stood for. That evening, as Michelle sat on the couch with a cup of tea in her hands, Daniel carefully listened to every detail. She described the small, cutting remarks Mr. Edwards had made over the months, the way her contributions were constantly overlooked, and how he always seemed to hold her to a higher standard than anyone else on the team. "It's not about the work, Daniel," she said softly. "It never was. He just didn't like me, and I can't figure out why." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "You shouldn't have to figure out why. You deserve to be treated with respect, no matter what. And if someone like him can't see that, then it's time he learned a lesson." Michelle looked at him, unsure of what he meant. "Daniel, I just want to move on. I don't want to cause any trouble." But Daniel wasn't about to let it go. Trouble wasn't what he wanted either, but he also couldn't stand by and let someone like Mr. Edwards think he could get away with his behavior. Daniel believed in accountability, and if there was one thing he had learned in his career, It was that people like Mr. Edwards thrived in environments where no one pushed back. That was about to change. The next morning, Michelle woke up to find Daniel already dressed and heading out the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, still groggy. He smiled faintly, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Don't worry about it. Just trust me." Michelle watched him leave, her curiosity mingled with a lingering sense of unease. She knew Daniel wasn't someone who acted impulsively. Whatever he was planning, it would be thoughtful, deliberate, and impactful. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't know the full extent of what he was capable of. Meanwhile, at the office, the atmosphere was different. Mr. Edwards walked through the halls with his usual arrogance. But there was an undercurrent of unease among the employees. News of Michelle's sudden dismissal had spread quickly, and while no one dared to speak out loud, there were murmurs of discontent. Everyone had seen how hard she worked and how unfairly she had been treated. But Mr. Edwards, oblivious as ever, continued on as if nothing had happened. Unbeknownst to him, Daniel was already making moves. He started by reaching out to a few key contacts, people who owed him favors, respected his judgment, or simply knew better than to ignore a call from him. These weren't just casual acquaintances, they were individuals who had the power to make things happen. Daniel wasn't one to boast about his connections, but in moments like this, he understood their value. As the day went on, subtle ripples began to form. Emails were sent, phone calls were made, and quiet conversations took place behind closed doors. Daniel was meticulous in his approach, ensuring that every step he took was calculated and purposeful. This wasn't about revenge, it was about setting the record straight and ensuring that Michelle's story wasn't just another footnote in a long history of workplace discrimination. Back at home, Michelle couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Part of her was relieved to be free from the toxic environment she had endured for so long, but another part of her felt the sting of injustice. She had worked so hard, given so much, and yet it had all been taken away from her in an instant. She thought about the countless others who had likely faced similar situations, people who didn't have someone like Daniel in their corner. That evening, Daniel returned home with a calm demeanor, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "Michelle," he began, sitting down across from her. "I need you to trust me. What I'm doing isn't just for you, it's for everyone who's been in your shoes. People like Mr. Edwards get away with this because no one stands up to them. That ends now." Michelle nodded slowly, her trust in Daniel unwavering. She didn't know what he had planned, but she knew he wouldn't let her down. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said softly. He smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "Always." The next few days were a blur of quiet but significant developments. Daniel's efforts were beginning to bear fruit, though Michelle was still in the dark about the specifics. All she knew was that something was happening, something big. Meanwhile, at the office, Mr. Edwards started noticing subtle changes. Meetings he wasn't invited to, decisions being made without his input, and an unusual amount of scrutiny on his team's performance. The tension was palpable, but Mr. Edwards dismissed it as a temporary setback. What he didn't realize was that his days of unchecked power were numbered. As the pieces of Daniel's plan came together, it became clear that this wasn't just about Michelle anymore. It was about holding Mr. Edwards accountable for his actions and ensuring that the workplace became a fair and inclusive environment for everyone. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more complicated, an unexpected visitor arrived at the office. Mr. Edwards, caught off guard, found himself face to face with someone he never imagined he'd meet, a person whose presence alone was enough to change the course of everything. The story was far from over, and as the truth began to unfold, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The question wasn't just about what would happen to Mr. Edwards, but also about the impact of standing up against injustice and how one person's courage could ripple through an entire organization. The unexpected visitor at the office was a man who walked with quiet confidence, his tailored suit and calm demeanor exuding authority. He didn't look like someone you'd forget easily, and his arrival caused a ripple of whispers among the employees. They couldn't figure out who he was, but his presence was enough to make people pause and take notice. Mr. Edwards, however, remained oblivious to the significance of this man until he was summoned to an impromptu meeting. When Mr. Edwards stepped into the room, he was met by the piercing gaze of none other than Daniel. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just some random meeting, this was personal. Daniel's calm voice broke the silence as he introduced himself, though his tone carried an unmistakable edge. "I believe you know my wife, Michelle," he said, his words deliberate and measured. Mr. Edwards faltered, his mind racing as he tried to piece together how this man, who clearly held influence, was connected to the employee he had so casually dismissed. He managed a weak response, but Daniel didn't give him much time to recover. Instead, Daniel turned the conversation toward the culture of the workplace, the patterns of behavior that had gone unchecked, and the need for accountability. His words were sharp, but they weren't angry, they were firm and filled with purpose. Outside the room, the office was abuzz. Rumors spread quickly as employees tried to make sense of what was happening. Many of them had long felt the sting of Mr. Edwards' biases, but seeing someone stand up to him in such a direct way was unprecedented. Some quietly cheered for Michelle, while others speculated about Daniel's identity and his connection to the company. Meanwhile, Michelle was at home, completely unaware of what was unfolding. She had spent the day reflecting on her time at the office, thinking about the moments that had worn her down and the small victories she had clung to. She had no idea that her husband was taking steps to address the injustice she had faced, nor did she know the magnitude of what was at stake. As the day turned into evening, Daniel returned home with the same calm demeanor he always carried, but Michelle could sense something was different. "You've been quiet," she said, watching him closely. Daniel hesitated for a moment before responding. "I met with Mr. Edwards today," he admitted. Michelle's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and apprehension on her face. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't say anything that wasn't true," Daniel replied. "I simply reminded him that actions have consequences, and that respect isn't optional in a workplace." Michelle wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or nervous. She trusted Daniel, but she also knew how vindictive Mr. Edwards could be. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel's expression softened as he took her hand. "Now we let the truth do the work. This isn't just about you, Michelle. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." The next day at the office, things took an even more unexpected turn. An external team arrived to conduct an internal review, something that hadn't happened in years. Employees were interviewed one by one, and the questions they were asked revealed a clear focus on workplace culture and leadership. People who had long been afraid to speak up suddenly found an opportunity to share their experiences, and the stories they told painted a damning picture of Mr. Edwards. For the first time, Mr. Edwards found himself on the defensive. His usual bravado was replaced with a nervous energy as he tried to navigate the scrutiny. He attempted to downplay the complaints, but the evidence was mounting against him. His history of favoritism, dismissive behavior, and unfair treatment of certain employees was no longer something he could hide. At the same time, Daniel's actions weren't just about holding Mr. Edwards accountable, they were about creating change. He reached out to other leaders within the company, proposing a series of initiatives to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. His approach was strategic and forward-thinking, focusing on solutions rather than just exposing the problems. It was clear that he wasn't just fighting for Michelle, he was fighting for something bigger. But amidst all the upheaval, Michelle found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt a sense of validation knowing that her struggles were finally being acknowledged. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for the turmoil that was unfolding. What if this just makes things worse for everyone? She asked Daniel one evening. Daniel looked at her with unwavering determination. "Change isn't easy," he said. "It's messy, and it's uncomfortable. But it's necessary. You didn't do anything wrong, Michelle. All you did was show up, work hard, and treat people with respect. If that's a problem for someone, then they're the ones who need to change, not you." Meanwhile, back at the office, the tension continued to build. Employees who had once been silent were now finding their voices, and the stories they shared created a ripple effect. People who had endured years of mistreatment began to realize they weren't alone, and that realization gave them the courage to speak out. It was as if a dam had broken, and the truth was flooding through. Mr. Edwards, however, refused to go down without a fight. He called a meeting with his team, attempting to rally support and shift the narrative in his favor. But the cracks in his facade were starting to show. Even those who had once sided with him were beginning to question whether it was worth aligning themselves with someone whose actions had brought so much scrutiny to the company. As the days turned into weeks, the conflict only deepened. The internal review revealed systemic issues that went far beyond Mr. Edwards, and the company's leadership found themselves facing tough decisions. Daniel's involvement added a layer of complexity to the situation, as his influence and credibility made it impossible for them to ignore the need for change. For Michelle, the journey was far from over. She watched from the sidelines as the battle played out, torn between relief and anxiety. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but one thing was clear: the days of silent acceptance were over. The question now was whether the company would rise to the occasion or crumble under the weight of its own shortcomings. And amidst it all, the mystery of Daniel's true role in this unfolding drama remained. Who exactly was he, and how had he managed to set these events in motion so effectively? Michelle couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his story than she realized. The answers would come, but not yet. For now, the tension lingered, leaving everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the office had reached a boiling point, and it felt as though every conversation, every glance, was charged with unspoken questions. Who was Daniel, really? Why had he taken such a personal interest in confronting Mr. Edwards? And most importantly, what was going to happen next? Whispers traveled from cubicle to cubicle, each employee adding their own theory to the growing swirl of speculation. For the first time in years, it felt like the office's invisible hierarchy was cracking, revealing all the ugliness that had been hidden beneath the surface. Michelle found herself caught in the middle of it all, though not by choice. People who had barely spoken to her before were now stopping by to offer encouragement or ask her opinion on what was happening. She didn't know how to respond. On one hand, she felt a sense of validation, finally, people were acknowledging what she had endured. But on the other, she was still reeling from the uncertainty of it all. Would this lead to real change, or would it just be another fleeting moment of drama that left the root problems untouched? Meanwhile, Mr. Edwards was struggling to maintain control. His attempts to rally support among the staff had largely failed, leaving him increasingly isolated. Yet, he wasn't ready to give up. He spent hours in closed-door meetings with higher-ups, spinning his version of events and trying to deflect blame. But no matter how hard he tried to manipulate the narrative, the facts kept catching up to him. The internal review had uncovered emails, reports, and testimony that painted a damning picture of his leadership. His once unshakable confidence was now replaced with a simmering frustration that he could barely contain. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed unshaken. He continued to work quietly behind the scenes, meeting with key decision-makers and presenting his case with calm, unrelenting logic. He wasn't just advocating for Michelle, he was pushing for a broader shift in the company's culture. His arguments were impossible to ignore, and even those who had initially been skeptical of his involvement began to see the merit in what he was saying. But there was still one question that lingered in everyone's minds. How had Daniel gained such access and influence? It was clear he wasn't just an outsider looking in, but his exact connection to the company remained a mystery. As the internal review neared its conclusion, the pressure on Mr. Edwards intensified. Rumors began circulating that the findings would include recommendations for disciplinary action, possibly even termination. The thought of losing his position, his power, was almost unbearable to him. He began to lash out, his temper flaring in meetings and his behavior becoming even more erratic. His facade of professionalism was crumbling, and it was clear to everyone that he was desperate to hold on to whatever control he had left. One evening, long after most of the employees had gone home, Michelle found herself staying late to catch up on some work. The office was eerily quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound breaking the silence. As she gathered her things to leave, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Michelle," Mr. Edwards said, his tone unusually subdued. She turned to see him standing there, his expression a mix of anger and something that almost resembled regret. "I didn't mean for things to get this far," he began, his words halting and uncertain. "You have to understand, this wasn't personal. It was just business." Michelle stared at him, unsure of how to respond. His words felt hollow, like an attempt to save face rather than a genuine apology. "It felt personal to me," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "And to a lot of other people in this office." Mr. Edwards sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Decisions have to be made, and not everyone's going to like them. That's just how it is." "Maybe," Michelle said, meeting his gaze. "But treating people with respect isn't a decision. It's a choice you make every single day. And you chose not to." Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both of them turned to see Daniel approaching, his presence commanding as always. He glanced between Michelle and Mr. Edwards, his expression unreadable. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked, his tone polite but with an underlying sharpness that couldn't be ignored. Mr. Edwards stiffened, his earlier vulnerability replaced by defensiveness. "No, we were just talking," he said quickly, his voice tight. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Mr. Edwards. "Good," he said. "Because there's a meeting tomorrow morning that I think you'll find enlightening." With that, he turned to Michelle, his expression softening. "Ready to go?" he asked. She nodded, grabbing her bag and following him out of the office. The next morning, the tension in the office was palpable. Everyone had been called to an all-hands meeting, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. As employees filed into the conference room, they exchanged hushed whispers, their curiosity and nerves getting the better of them. Michelle sat quietly near the back, her heart pounding as she tried to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. When the meeting began, it was clear this wasn't just another routine gathering. Representatives from the internal review team stood at the front of the room, their expressions serious. They began by outlining the findings of their investigation, detailing the patterns of misconduct and mismanagement that had come to light. As they spoke, the room grew increasingly tense. Employees who had once feared speaking out now found themselves nodding in agreement, their shared experiences finally being acknowledged. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. One of the representatives turned to address Mr. Edwards directly. "Based on our findings," she said, her voice steady, "we have determined that your actions as a leader have violated company policies and the principles of equity and respect that we strive to uphold. As a result, we are recommending." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Everyone in the room leaned forward, their breath caught in their throats. Michelle's heart raced as she realized they were on the brink of a resolution, or at least, the beginning of one. Daniel sat a few rows ahead of her, his posture calm but his focus razor-sharp. Whatever was about to happen next, it was clear that the truth was finally coming to light. And as the tension reached its peak, Michelle couldn't help but wonder, would this be the moment that changed everything? Or was the real battle only just beginning? As the representative's words hovered in the room, like a fragile thread about to snap, the tension was shattered by an unexpected voice from the doorway. "Before you continue," a calm but commanding tone interrupted, "there's something else you should all know." Heads turned in unison, and there stood a man many employees hadn't seen before, but those who did recognized him immediately. It was the CEO of the company himself, Mr. Langston Royce, a figure who rarely made appearances at these kinds of meetings. His arrival sent a ripple of murmurs through the room, and even the review panel looked momentarily taken aback. Michelle's stomach dropped, and she glanced nervously at Daniel, whose face betrayed no emotion. But something about his stillness made her feel as though he had anticipated this all along. Mr. Edwards, however, was visibly shaken. His usual arrogance seemed to crumble under the weight of the CEO's unexpected presence. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his knuckles gripping the edge of the table as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. The CEO stepped into the room, his sharp suit and deliberate movements exuding authority. "I've been following this situation closely," he began, his voice measured but firm. "And while I appreciate the efforts of the review team, there's a layer to this story that needs to be addressed before we proceed any further." A hushed silence fell over the room as Mr. Royce turned his attention to Daniel. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his tone carrying a hint of familiarity, "perhaps you'd like to explain your connection to all of this." For the first time since he had walked into the office weeks ago, Daniel stood up. He didn't rush to fill the silence but instead took a moment to scan the room, his gaze settling briefly on Michelle before addressing the CEO. "My connection," Daniel began, his voice steady, "is that I've seen this pattern of behavior before. In fact, I've been tasked with investigating and dismantling it in multiple divisions across this company. It's why I was brought in, to ensure that this kind of toxic leadership doesn't go unchecked." A wave of confusion and realization swept through the employees. Daniel wasn't just an outsider or a concerned husband, he was part of an internal compliance and ethics initiative directly under the CEO's office. His presence wasn't coincidental, it was intentional, calculated. Michelle's mind raced as she pieced together what this meant. Daniel hadn't just been advocating for her. He had been strategically dismantling the structures that had allowed someone like Mr. Edwards to thrive unchecked. "But that's not all," Daniel continued, his voice growing firmer. "What this investigation has uncovered goes beyond Mr. Edwards' actions. There's a systemic issue here, a culture that tolerates discrimination, silences those who speak out, and prioritizes profit over people. If we don't address this, replacing one bad leader won't fix the problem." The weight of his words settled over the room, and for a moment, no one dared to speak. Then, to everyone's shock, the CEO nodded in agreement. "That's precisely why I'm here," Mr. Royce said. "This isn't just about one man's mistakes. It's about ensuring this company lives up to the values we claim to represent. And it starts with accountability at every level." Michelle felt a mix of emotions, validation, relief, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. While it was clear that Mr. Edwards' days at the company were numbered, The scope of the conversation suggested this was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. And yet, there was still one piece of the puzzle that remained unresolved. As the CEO continued outlining plans for broader reforms, Mr. Edwards suddenly spoke up, his voice trembling but defiant. "This is ridiculous," he said, his frustration bubbling over. "You're letting outsiders dictate how we run our business. You're all buying into this narrative without considering the bigger picture." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might regain some of his footing. But then Daniel stepped forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "The bigger picture," he said, locking eyes with Mr. Edwards, "is that people like you have been allowed to act without consequence for far too long. That ends now." The room erupted in murmurs again, but this time, there was a sense of finality in the air. Yet, just as it seemed the meeting was reaching its peak, the CEO's assistant rushed into the room, her face pale. She whispered something into Mr. Royce's ear, and his expression darkened. "It seems we have another matter to address," he said, his voice taking on a grave tone. "And this one changes everything." Every eye in the room was on the CEO as he motioned for the assistant to continue. She hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's evidence," she said, her words careful and deliberate, "that certain individuals have been tampering with the review process, suppressing key testimonies and documents." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Michelle felt her chest tighten as the implications of this revelation sank in. Someone had been actively trying to cover up the extent of the misconduct. But who? And why? All eyes turned to Mr. Edwards, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is absurd," he stammered, his voice rising. "I've done no such thing." But the assistant wasn't finished. She handed a folder to the CEO, who flipped through its contents with a grim expression. "The evidence suggests otherwise," Mr. Royce said, his tone sharp. "And it raises serious questions about how far you are willing to go to protect yourself." The room fell into stunned silence once again, the weight of this new revelation pulling everyone deeper into the unfolding drama. Michelle felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized they were on the brink of uncovering something much bigger than she had anticipated. And as Daniel sat back down, his expression unreadable, Michelle couldn't help but wonder if even he had anticipated this twist. The stakes had just been raised, and it was clear that the story was far from over. With each new piece of information, the web of deceit and corruption grew more tangled, leaving everyone in the room wondering what would be revealed next, and who would ultimately be held accountable. The room seemed to hold its breath as the CEO laid the folder on the table, his piercing gaze fixed on Mr. Edwards. For a man accustomed to control, Edwards now looked like someone scrambling to find footing on a crumbling cliff. His protests grew weaker with each passing second, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him like an unavoidable tide. Yet, in his eyes, there was still a flicker of defiance, as though he believed he could talk his way out of the inevitable. But then Daniel spoke, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Before we jump to conclusions," he said, standing up once more, "I think it's important to understand how this situation spiraled to this point. It wasn't just about Michelle or Mr. Edwards. It's about a culture that allowed people to look the other way, to enable behavior that should have been stopped long ago." His words shifted the focus from one man to the broader system, a reminder that the real conflict wasn't just about exposing a single bad actor but about dismantling the structures that had allowed him to thrive. Mr. Royce nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "And that's exactly why this investigation isn't stopping here," he said. "We're going to audit every division, every complaint that's been buried, and we're going to make this company a place where this kind of behavior isn't just punished, it's impossible." As the weight of his declaration sank in, Michelle felt a swell of vindication. But just as she allowed herself a moment of relief, the unexpected twist came. One of the senior review panel members, a quiet woman who had remained largely in the background, suddenly cleared her throat. "There's something else," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "Something that I've been reluctant to bring up until now." All eyes turned to her as she produced a USB drive from her pocket and slid it across the table toward the CEO. "I received this anonymously last week," she continued, "but I didn't fully understand its significance until today." The room was electric with anticipation as Mr. Royce inserted the drive into a laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of emails and documents that seemed to implicate not just Edwards but several other high-ranking executives in a coordinated effort to suppress complaints and protect their own interests. Michelle's jaw dropped as she scanned the screen. Names she recognized, names of people who had seemed untouchable, flashed before her eyes. This wasn't just about Edwards anymore. It was about a network of complicity that reached far beyond him. The tension in the room reached a fever pitch as the CEO's face hardened. "This," he said, his voice icy, "is far worse than I anticipated." Edwards, realizing that his web of deceit had fully unraveled, slumped in his chair, his bravado finally giving way to the weight of his actions. But the senior panel member wasn't finished. "There's more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "One of the emails suggests that someone in this very room knew about all of this and chose to stay silent." A wave of unease swept through the room as people exchanged nervous glances. Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. Was it possible that someone she had trusted had been complicit? The revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, threatening to unleash chaos at any moment. But before the accusation could escalate, Daniel stepped forward once more, his voice calm but resolute. "The truth," he said, "is that accountability isn't just about punishing those who did wrong. It's about ensuring that everyone has the courage to speak up when they see injustice. If we focus only on blame, we'll miss the opportunity to create real change." His words seemed to break the tension, shifting the focus from finger-pointing to the broader goal of transformation. The CEO nodded, his expression softening as he turned back to the room. "This ends today," he said. "We will deal with everyone involved, no matter their rank. But more importantly, we're going to ensure that no one ever feels silenced or powerless in this company again." As the meeting concluded, there was a sense of both closure and uncertainty. Edwards was escorted out, his reign finally over, but the revelations had opened a Pandora's box that would take months, if not years, to fully unravel. Michelle felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion as she left the room. She knew this wasn't the end of her journey but the beginning of something new, something better. And as she walked out of the building with Daniel by her side, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Sometimes, it seemed, justice took its time. But when it arrived, it came with the power to change everything. What she didn't know, however, was that the anonymous whistleblower who had exposed the deeper network was someone she never would have expected. But that, perhaps, was a story for another day. As Michelle and Daniel stepped into the cool evening air, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle in. The company that had once been a place of pride for Michelle had become a battleground for justice, and though the war was far from over, this victory felt significant. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "You stood up when it mattered most." Michelle gave a small smile, though the exhaustion in her eyes was evident. "We did it," she corrected, her voice firm. "I wouldn't have made it through without you. And not just you," she added, thinking of the anonymous whistleblower and even the senior panel member who had stepped forward at the last moment. "It took all of us." The following weeks were a whirlwind of change. The company launched an independent investigation, hiring external auditors to ensure that every buried complaint and questionable decision was unearthed. Several executives were suspended, pending the results of the audit, and Edwards' termination became the symbol of a broader reckoning. Employees who had long felt silenced began to come forward, sharing stories that painted a grim picture of the workplace under Edwards' leadership. It was painful, but it was also necessary, a cleansing of old wounds that had festered for too long. For Michelle, the days that followed were a mix of relief and uncertainty. The sudden attention brought both praise and criticism. While many hailed her bravery, there were whispers from others, resentments, doubts, and questions about her motivations. She learned to let the noise pass, focusing instead on the positive changes happening around her. It wasn't easy, but she reminded herself of why she had spoken out in the first place. One afternoon, she received an unexpected call from the senior panel member who had introduced the USB drive during the pivotal meeting. "Michelle," the woman said warmly, "I just wanted to thank you. What you did inspired me to act when I wasn't sure I could. I hope you know that." The words struck a chord with Michelle. For all the stress and fear, moments like these reminded her that change wasn't just about policies or punishment, it was about empowering people to believe in their own strength. As the weeks turned into months, the company began to transform. Training programs were implemented to address bias and build a culture of inclusivity. New channels for anonymous reporting were introduced, giving employees a safe space to voice their concerns. Michelle found herself part of a new diversity and ethics committee, a group tasked with ensuring that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. Daniel, too, played a quiet but crucial role in the aftermath. His calm wisdom and unwavering support became a source of strength not just for Michelle but for many employees who struggled to process the upheaval. He often reminded her that progress was never linear and that setbacks were just opportunities to regroup and push forward. His words echoed in her mind as she navigated the challenges of her new role. One day, as Michelle was clearing out her old desk to move into a new office, one that came with her promotion, She found a handwritten note tucked into a drawer. The words were simple but powerful: "Keep shining your light. The world needs it." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. She knew it was from someone whose life she had unknowingly touched, someone who had seen her fight and felt inspired to start their own. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. At a company-wide town hall meeting, the CEO addressed the entire staff, acknowledging the company's failings and laying out a clear plan for moving forward. As he spoke, he paused to recognize Michelle. "It takes immense courage to stand up for what's right," he said. Michelle didn't just challenge the status quo, she reminded us all of the kind of company we want to be. Let her example guide us as we rebuild. The room erupted into applause, but Michelle barely heard it. She was lost in her own thoughts, reflecting on how far she had come. In that moment, she realized that her journey wasn't just about exposing injustice or holding people accountable. It was about proving to herself that she was capable of change, of making a difference, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. As the applause faded, Michelle glanced at Daniel, who gave her a small, knowing nod. This wasn't the end of her story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. One where she could walk into the future with her head held high, knowing she had fought for something bigger than herself. The story of Michelle, her husband Daniel, and the downfall of Edwards wasn't just a tale of justice. It was a reminder that in every dark moment, there's an opportunity to stand up, to speak out, and to be the catalyst for change. And sometimes, the most unexpected heroes emerge when the world needs them most. It was a quiet afternoon in a small southern town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever happened, or so people thought. Officer Jack Taylor, a young cop with only a few years on the force, cruised through the familiar streets in his patrol car. Jack prided himself on keeping the peace, even if it often meant dealing with little more than parking violations or the occasional noise complaint. But that day, something happened that would change everything, an incident that no one in town would ever forget. It started with a call. Dispatch crackled through the radio, reporting a disturbance at a modest home on the edge of town. The voice on the other end was calm but firm: an elderly woman had refused to comply with a court order. Jack couldn't imagine what kind of trouble a 98-year-old could cause, but orders were orders. He headed to the address, the unease creeping up on him like the humid southern air. When Jack arrived, the house was as unassuming as its owner. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, whispering among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. Jack stepped out of his car, his polished boots crunching against the gravel driveway. He scanned the yard, noting the overgrown bushes and the peeling paint on the shutters. It was a place that had seen better days, but it held a sense of history, like it had weathered storms no one else could understand. And then, there she was. Sitting calmly on the porch in a worn rocking chair was Ms. Louise Carter. Her frame was frail, her hands resting on a cane, but her eyes burned with a quiet defiance. She was dressed neatly in a floral dress, her white hair tucked under a straw hat. To Jack, she looked like someone's sweet grandmother, the kind who baked pies and told old stories. But the way she stared him down made it clear she wasn't backing down. "Ma'am," Jack began, trying to keep his tone respectful, "I'm here about the court order. It's my job to see that it's enforced." Louise didn't flinch. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice steady. "But some things aren't right, young man, and I won't be a part of them." Jack hesitated. He'd been trained to handle resistance, but this wasn't the kind of defiance he was used to. This wasn't a drunken brawl or an unruly teenager. This was something deeper, something that felt wrong. Still, he had a job to do. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me," he said, stepping closer to the porch. Louise leaned forward slightly, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. "Do you know why they're doing this?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it, like she was testing him. Jack shook his head. "I'm just following the orders I was given." Louise let out a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "That's the problem, isn't it? People following orders without questioning what's right." The crowd murmured, their whispers growing louder. Jack glanced at them nervously. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he could feel the weight of their eyes on him. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. "Ma'am," he said again, more firmly this time, "if you don't come willingly, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." Louise looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she rose from the rocking chair. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if she were preparing for something much bigger than the scene playing out before them. "You can arrest me if you want," she said softly. "But you'll regret it." Her words sent a chill down Jack's spine, though he couldn't explain why. He reached for his handcuffs, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. As he gently took her arm, he noticed something strange. Her neighbors weren't just watching. They were filming. Every phone in the crowd was raised, capturing every second of the encounter. Jack escorted Louise to the patrol car, feeling the weight of their stares and the hum of their murmurs. He opened the door and helped her in, careful not to hurt her. She moved without resistance, her calm demeanor making the entire moment feel surreal. As he drove away, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. Louise sat silently in the back seat, her gaze fixed out the window. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to fill the car with an unspoken tension. What had she meant by those words? Why had the neighbors seemed so invested in her arrest? And why did Jack feel like he had just stepped into the middle of something much bigger than himself? The answers were coming, but not the ones Jack expected. As Jack drove toward the station, the uneasy silence in the patrol car gnawed at him. He glanced at Louise in the rearview mirror. She sat still, her hands folded over the cane she refused to part with, her posture too composed for someone who had just been arrested. Jack found himself questioning everything about the situation. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story behind this, one he didn't yet understand. When they arrived at the station, a few of Jack's colleagues were waiting by the entrance, their faces a mix of surprise and curiosity. It wasn't every day that someone like Louise Carter ended up in handcuffs. Jack opened the car door and helped her out, careful to keep his grip gentle but firm. She looked up at him, her piercing eyes locking onto his with an unsettling intensity. "You're going to learn today, officer," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Jack swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He walked her inside, the usual buzz of the station dying down as everyone turned to watch. It felt like all eyes were on him, not just his coworkers but the weight of something invisible, something bigger. Louise's presence commanded a strange kind of respect, even in handcuffs. As she was processed, Louise remained calm, answering the officer's questions with clarity and precision. She didn't seem rattled or angry, just resolute. Jack watched from a distance, feeling a pang of guilt creep into his chest. The more he observed, the more he doubted the necessity of her arrest. After she was fingerprinted and her personal items logged, she was led to a holding cell. As the heavy door clanged shut behind her, Louise turned to face Jack, who had been silently observing from the hallway. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked, her voice carrying across the cold, sterile air of the station. Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "No, ma'am," he admitted. "I just got the call." Louise tilted her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "That's the problem, son. You only got the call. You didn't ask why." Her words lingered with him as he walked back to his desk. His shift wasn't over yet, but Jack couldn't focus on his paperwork. Instead, he found himself opening a browser on his computer and typing her name into the search bar. What came up made his stomach drop. Louise Carter wasn't just an elderly woman. She was a local legend, a civil rights activist whose actions had shaped the very town Jack lived in. Decades ago, she had been on the front lines of protests, fighting for the integration of schools and the right to vote. Her name was etched into the town's history, and her face was in grainy black and white photos that depicted marches and sit-ins. But the most startling part of all was the court order. Digging further, Jack discovered that Louise had been fighting to keep her home from being seized by the city. The house she had lived in for over 70 years sat on land that developers now wanted to turn into a commercial complex. The court had ruled in favor of the city, but Louise had refused to leave. Jack's heart sank as the pieces came together. This wasn't about some simple legal matter. It was about a woman standing her ground, defending her history, her life, and her dignity. And he had just been the tool used to strip it away. Before he could process his thoughts, the station phone rang. The desk sergeant picked it up, listened for a moment, then called Jack over. "It's for you," he said, handing him the receiver. Jack frowned as he took the call. "Officer Taylor speaking." The voice on the other end was sharp and unmistakably angry. "Officer, this is Councilman Dean," the man said, his tone making it clear he wasn't calling to exchange pleasantries. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Jack blanked, caught off guard. "Sir, I was just following orders." "Orders?" Dean barked. "You just arrested Louise Carter. Do you understand what that means? This isn't some random case. The media is already picking it up, and the mayor's office is furious. I suggest you fix this, and fast." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jack standing there with the phone still pressed to his ear. His mind raced as the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a disaster, And he was caught in the middle of it. He looked toward the holding cells, where Louise sat quietly, her back straight and her gaze steady, as though she had expected this all along. Jack realized then that her words hadn't been a threat, they had been a warning. And now, the storm was coming. But the question remained, how far would this go, and would Jack be able to make it right before it was too late? The weight of the councilman's words hung over Jack like a storm cloud. He set the phone down slowly, his hand trembling ever so slightly. What had seemed like a routine call earlier that day now felt like the beginning of something far more complicated and dangerous. He glanced back toward the holding cells, where Louise sat with a calmness that unnerved him. She wasn't pacing or fretting like most people in custody. Instead, she exuded the kind of stillness that came from someone who had lived through storms far worse than this one. Jack couldn't stay at his desk. He had to know more. He walked down the dimly lit hallway toward the records room, determined to dig deeper into Louise's past. He typed her name into the station's database, hoping to find something that would make sense of the day's events. What he uncovered only deepened the mystery. There were dozens of entries linked to Louise Carter's name, but not in the way Jack expected. Most of the records were decades old, incidents involving protests, arrests during sit-ins, and lawsuits filed against local officials. The details painted a picture of a woman who had spent her life fighting battles that others were too afraid to confront. But there was one record that stood out above the rest, dated nearly 50 years ago. Jack clicked on it, his breath catching in his throat as the screen loaded. The file described an incident from the 1970s, when Louise had been arrested during a march to demand equal housing rights. The arrest report was brief, but what caught Jack's attention was the note scrawled at the bottom by the officer who had processed her. It read, "She warned us. Said we'd regret this one day. I didn't believe her then. Now I do." The words sent a chill down Jack's spine. It wasn't just the eeriness of the note itself, it was the sense of déjà vu it gave him. Those were almost the exact words Louise had spoken to him earlier that day. He leaned back in his chair, trying to piece it all together. It felt like there was a puzzle here, but someone had hidden half the pieces. Why would an elderly woman, once a pillar of the civil rights movement, resist so strongly over a house? Was it just about preserving her home, or was there something deeper at play? Jack decided he needed answers straight from the source. He headed back to the holding cell, his footsteps echoing through the quiet station. As he approached, Louise looked up, her expression unchanged. It was as if she had been expecting him. "Changed your mind about asking questions, have you?" she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Jack cleared his throat, trying to shake the growing unease he felt in her presence. "I've been looking into your history, Ms. Carter," he admitted. "It seems you've been through a lot." Louise nodded, her gaze steady. "You could say that. I've seen the worst this town has to offer, and sometimes the best. Depends on the day." He leaned against the bars, lowering his voice. "Why did you resist the court order? I've read about your work, your marches, your fights for justice. You've faced bigger battles than this. So why now? Why risk everything over a house?" For the first time, Louise's expression softened, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes. She leaned forward on her cane, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because this house isn't just a house. It's history. My history. My family's history. It's where my parents fought to keep us safe when the world wanted us gone. It's where neighbors came together to plan marches and sit-ins. It's where we built a community out of nothing." Jack listened, the weight of her words sinking in. He had grown up in this town but had never thought much about its history. Louise's house was just another old building to him, but to her, it was a living memory of everything she had endured and accomplished. "Why do they want it so badly?" Jack asked. Louise's jaw tightened, and her eyes darkened. "They don't care about me or this house. They care about money. Developers want to tear it down to make way for another strip mall or luxury condos. They call it progress, but it's just greed dressed up in a suit and tie." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to believe her, but part of him still struggled to understand why the situation had escalated to this point. "I'm not saying I agree with what's happening," he said carefully, "but couldn't you have fought this another way? You have a legacy, Ms. Carter. People respect you. Maybe there's still a chance to negotiate." Louise laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Negotiate? With people who don't even see me as human? You're young, Officer Taylor. You still think the system works for everyone. But trust me, it only works for those who hold the power. And people like me? We only get power when we take it." Her words hit Jack harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down, He knew there was truth in what she said. He thought about the crowd outside her house, the way her neighbors had rallied around her, filming every moment. It wasn't just about Louise. It was about what she represented to them, a symbol of resistance, of standing up when no one else would. Before he could respond, the door to the holding area swung open, and the desk sergeant stepped in, his face tense. "Taylor," he said, his voice low. "You've got visitors." Jack turned, confused. "Visitors?" The sergeant nodded. "A lawyer and some reporters. Looks like word's gotten out." Jack's stomach churned. This was spiraling out of control faster than he could keep up. He looked back at Louise, who gave him a knowing smile. "Told you this was bigger than you," she said. Jack left the holding area, his mind racing. In the station lobby, a small group had gathered, 2 reporters with cameras slung over their shoulders, a man in a sharp suit who could only be Louise's lawyer, and a woman holding a clipboard who appeared to be some kind of activist. They were speaking with the desk sergeant, their voices firm but polite. The lawyer turned as Jack approached, sizing him up with a quick glance. "Officer Taylor, I presume?" he said, extending a hand. Jack shook it, noting the man's firm grip. "I'm Richard Hargrove," the lawyer said. "I'm here on behalf of Ms. Carter. I trust you're aware of the situation." Jack nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "I am." Richard's expression was unreadable, but his tone was measured. "Then you'll understand why this arrest is not only unnecessary but also a serious misstep. Ms. Carter has a right to due process, and this spectacle is an insult to everything she's worked for." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, one of the reporters stepped forward, a microphone in hand. "Officer Taylor, do you have any comment on the arrest of a 98-year-old civil rights icon? What led to this decision?" The room seemed to close in around Jack. Cameras were pointed at him, lights glaring in his face. He felt the weight of their questions, their expectations, their judgment. And behind it all, Louise's voice echoed in his mind, "You'll regret this." The tension was mounting, and Jack realized that whatever came next would define not just his day but possibly his career. The world was watching now, and there was no turning back. Jack stood frozen, the buzz of reporters' voices and the glare of camera lights swirling around him like a storm. His usual confidence as an officer was gone, replaced by a sinking feeling that he was part of something far bigger than himself. He had walked into this thinking it was a routine arrest, but now it felt like he was carrying the weight of an entire town's history on his shoulders. I'm just an officer following protocol," he finally managed to say, his voice uneven. "This wasn't my decision." The reporter didn't back down. "But you were the one who made the arrest, correct? Didn't you think it was excessive to handcuff someone of her age, given her reputation?" Jack opened his mouth to respond, but Richard Hargrove, Louise's lawyer, stepped in smoothly. "That's enough," he said firmly, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "Officer Taylor isn't the story here. The story is about Louise Carter, a woman who has spent her life fighting for justice, now being treated like a criminal for defending her home." The reporters shifted their focus, firing questions at Richard instead, but Jack could still feel the weight of their stares. He backed away toward the hallway, his pulse racing. He needed air, space to think, but even in the quieter part of the station, the walls felt like they were closing in. He glanced toward the holding cells, where Louise sat as if none of this chaos were happening. Her calmness wasn't just unsettling, it was infuriating. How could she be so composed when his entire world was unraveling? Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the desk sergeant's voice behind him. "You okay, Taylor?" Jack turned, realizing he must look as shaken as he felt. He nodded quickly, though it was far from the truth. "Yeah. Just processing everything." The sergeant studied him for a moment before lowering his voice. "Look, this whole thing's a mess, but don't take it personally. You were doing your job. You couldn't have known it'd blow up like this." "Maybe I should have," Jack muttered under his breath, his gaze drifting back to Louise. "She warned me." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Warned you about what?" Jack hesitated, unsure how to explain. "She said I'd regret it," he finally said. "And the more I think about it, the more I feel like she's right." The sergeant sighed, clapping a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Let the higher-ups deal with it. They'll smooth it over. Just keep your head down, and don't let it get to you." Jack nodded, though the advice did little to ease his turmoil. As the sergeant walked away, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a flurry of notifications, news articles, social media posts, even messages from friends. The arrest was already trending online, with headlines like "Civil Rights Icon Arrested," Outrage in small town. A 98-year-old activist defies court order, sparks nationwide debate. Scrolling through the comments, Jack felt his stomach churn. People were furious, calling for justice, demanding accountability. And his name was starting to appear, tied to words like disgrace and coward. He quickly locked the screen, shoving the phone back into his pocket. The station felt suffocating now, every noise amplified, every glance from his colleagues heavy with unspoken judgment. Jack knew he needed to confront Louise again, to understand what she wasn't saying. There had to be more to this than just a house. He walked back to the holding area, his footsteps echoing louder than they should have. Louise looked up as he approached. Her expression unreadable. "Back so soon?" she asked, her tone calm but with a hint of amusement. Jack leaned against the bars, lowering his voice. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Louise raised an eyebrow. "Enjoying? No, Officer Taylor. I don't enjoy being treated like a criminal. But I've been here before, and I've learned that patience is a weapon just as sharp as any blade." Her words stung, but Jack pushed forward. "Look, I don't agree with how this is playing out. But you've got people out there, lawyers, reporters, your neighbors, fighting for you. Why didn't you just let them handle it? Why make it harder on yourself?" Louise's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jack thought she might actually let her guard down. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because sometimes, officer, the fight isn't about winning. It's about making them see what they're trying to erase." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" Louise's eyes seemed to darken, her voice taking on a weight that made him feel like a child being lectured. "They want my house because it's inconvenient. It's a reminder of a time they'd rather forget, a time when people like me weren't supposed to have anything, let alone a home of our own. Every brick in that house has a story. Every scratch, every dent, every creak in the floorboards is a piece of history. My history. And if I let them take it, it's like saying none of it mattered." Her words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He had grown up in this town, but he had never thought about its history in the way Louise described. To him, the past was just that, the past. But to Louise, it was alive, breathing, woven into the very walls of her home. Before Jack could respond, the station doors burst open, and a new wave of voices flooded the air. He turned to see a crowd spilling into the lobby, neighbors, activists, even more reporters. They carried signs with phrases like "Justice for Louise" and "Protect our history." The energy in the room was electric, a mix of anger and determination that made the air feel heavy. The desk sergeant appeared again, his face pale. "Taylor, we've got a situation." Jack nodded, already feeling the weight of it. The crowd wasn't just here for Louise, they were here for answers, for justice, for something he wasn't sure he could give them. And as he looked back at her, sitting quietly in her cell, he realized that she had known this was coming all along. "You were right," Jack said softly, his voice barely audible over the commotion. "This is bigger than me." Louise smiled faintly, her expression almost sad. "It always was, officer. It always was." The station lobby was chaos. The voices of the crowd mingled with the sound of camera shutters, creating a cacophony that made it impossible to think clearly. Jack stood near the holding area, watching the scene unfold with a sense of dread. The crowd wasn't just angry, they were determined. They were there for Louise, but their frustration extended far beyond her arrest. It was about what she represented, the decades of struggle etched into every line on her face. From the corner of the room, Jack noticed Richard Hargrove speaking into a microphone, addressing the reporters with practiced confidence. "Louise Carter is not just a woman protecting her home," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "She's a symbol of resilience, of the fight against injustice that many thought was long over. But today proves that the fight is far from finished." The crowd erupted into cheers, the words striking a chord with everyone present. Jack's stomach tightened. He had thought of Louise as a stubborn old woman clinging to a house, but now he saw how much more she meant to these people. She wasn't just a person, she was a movement. As the noise in the lobby grew, Jack felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Chief Reynolds, his usually calm face lined with worry. "Taylor, we've got to handle this carefully," the chief said, his voice low. "This situation is a powder keg, and if we're not careful, it's going to explode." Jack nodded, but the weight of the situation felt crushing. "What do you want me to do, Chief?" "Stay out of sight for now," Reynolds said. "You're too close to this. Let me and the PR team handle the crowd. We don't need things getting worse." Jack hesitated, glancing back toward Louise's cell. "What about her?" Reynolds sighed, his expression grim. "We'll have to process her like anyone else." "But Let's just say we're treading lightly. The last thing we need is more bad press." Jack stepped aside as the chief walked toward the lobby, trying to project an air of authority. But even as Reynolds addressed the crowd, Jack could see the cracks in his confidence. This wasn't something that could be smoothed over with a press statement. It was a battle for the soul of the town, and no amount of careful wording could change that. Back in the holding area, Louise was watching everything with a calm, almost amused expression. Jack walked over to her, lowering his voice. "You've got half the town out there ready to fight for you. Did you know it would come to this?" Louise tilted her head, her gaze steady. "I didn't know," she admitted. "But I hoped. Sometimes it takes one spark to light a fire. I've seen it happen before." Jack leaned against the bars, his frustration bubbling over. "But what if it's a fire no one can control? What happens then?" Louise didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost sad. "Sometimes things have to burn before they can be rebuilt." Her words sent a chill through Jack, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He wanted to argue, to tell her that there were better ways to fight, but deep down, he wasn't sure he believed that anymore. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the station only grew. Outside, more people gathered, holding candles and chanting Louise's name. Inside, the officers were on edge, their usual routines disrupted by the weight of the situation. Jack wandered through the station, his thoughts swirling. Every time he tried to make sense of what was happening, he ended up with more questions than answers. At one point, he overheard two officers talking near the break room. "I heard the developers offered her a fortune for that house," one of them said. "Why didn't she just take the money and move?" "Because it's not about the money," the other replied. "It's about principle. You think she'd let them bulldoze her history for a strip mall? Not a chance." Jack walked away before he could hear more. The conversation only reinforced what he already knew: this wasn't just about a house. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be measured in dollars or court orders. That night, as the station quieted down, Jack found himself sitting at his desk, staring at the arrest report. He had filled out hundreds of these before, but this one felt different. Every detail seemed weighted, as if it carried more meaning than the words on the page. He thought about Louise's house, about the stories it held. He thought about the crowd outside, their faces lit by candlelight as they stood vigil. And he thought about his own role in all of it, the part he had played in setting this chain of events in motion. The silence was broken by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Jack looked up to see Louise's lawyer standing in the doorway, his suit slightly rumpled but his expression as sharp as ever. "You've got a problem, Officer Taylor," Richard said, walking over to Jack's desk. Jack frowned. "What now?" Richard placed a folder on the desk, opening it to reveal a stack of documents. "These are records from the town council's meetings over the past year," he said. "They show a pattern of targeting historically black neighborhoods for redevelopment. Louise's house is just the latest in a long line of properties they've tried to take." Jack skimmed the documents, his heart sinking as he read the details. This can't be legal," he said. "It's not," Richard replied. "But proving that in court is a long, uphill battle. In the meantime, they're banking on people like Louise giving up. They don't expect anyone to fight back." Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of the truth settling over him. "Why are you telling me this?" Richard's expression softened, just slightly. "Because you're not the enemy here, officer. You're just a cog in the machine. But you've got a choice. You can either keep turning the gears, or you can do something about it." Jack didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. The lawyer's words struck a nerve, forcing him to confront a question he had been avoiding all day: what kind of man did he want to be? As Richard walked away, Jack looked back toward the holding cells. Louise was still there, her calm demeanor unchanged. But now, Jack saw her in a different light. She wasn't just a woman fighting for her home. She was a symbol of everything the town had tried to ignore, a reminder that history couldn't be erased so easily. And as the night wore on, Jack realized that his part in this story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The weight of the day pressed heavily on Jack as the hours stretched into the early morning. The hum of fluorescent lights in the station became a constant background noise, blending with the muffled sounds of the crowd still gathered outside. Their chants had softened into a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat that refused to let the moment die. Jack couldn't shake Richard's words, "You've got a choice." It echoed in his mind, tangling with Louise's calm defiance and the stark truths laid out in those documents. He had spent years upholding laws he believed were fair, serving a town he thought he understood. But now, those beliefs felt as fragile as glass, cracking under the weight of everything he'd seen and heard. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He needed to move, to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Without thinking, he found himself walking toward the holding cells again. Louise looked up as he approached, her eyes sharp and knowing, as if she had been waiting for him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her tone almost easing. Jack smirked despite himself. "Something like that." He leaned against the bars, studying her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Jack broke the quiet. "Why didn't you just leave?" he asked, his voice low. "You had to know how hard this was going to get. Why stay and put yourself through all this?" Louise's expression softened, and she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her lap. "Because some things are worth the fight, Officer Taylor. Even if it costs you." Jack frowned, searching her face for answers. "But why you? Why does it have to be you?" Louise's gaze didn't waver. "Because if I don't stand up, who will? If I let them take my home, it's not just my story they're erasing, it's everyone who came before me. My parents built that house with their own hands, brick by brick, during a time when people like us weren't supposed to own anything. They poured their lives into it, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away without a fight." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Jack felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down, nodding slowly. He had never thought about history in such personal terms before. To him, it had always been something distant, a collection of dates and events in textbooks. But to Louise, it was alive, tangible, a part of who she was. Before Jack could respond, the sound of raised voices drew his attention back toward the lobby. He glanced over his shoulder, tension tightening in his chest. Something was happening. "I'll be back," he said, his voice almost a promise. Louise didn't reply, but her steady gaze followed him as he walked away. In the lobby, the scene had shifted. The crowd outside had grown larger, spilling into the street, their chants growing louder and more unified. Inside, Chief Reynolds was locked in a heated conversation with a man Jack didn't recognize, an older gentleman in a tailored suit who exuded an air of authority. "Who's that?" Jack asked the desk sergeant as he passed. The sergeant glanced up from his paperwork, his expression grim. "City Council rep. Came to assess the situation, whatever that means." Jack watched as the man gestured emphatically, his voice low but firm. The chief nodded reluctantly, his shoulders tense. Jack didn't like the look of it. As the councilman turned to leave, his eyes briefly met Jack's. There was something cold in his gaze, something calculating. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as the man walked out of the station and into the crowd, disappearing into the sea of faces. "What did he want?" Jack asked, approaching the chief. Reynolds sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "He's pressuring us to wrap this up quickly. Wants Louise out of here and the protest dispersed before it gets out of hand." Jack's jaw tightened. "And how are we supposed to do that?" Reynolds gave him a weary look. "That's the problem. There's no clean way to handle this. If we release her, it looks like we're backing down. If we keep her here, the crowd gets angrier. Either way, we're stuck in the middle." Jack shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Maybe the problem isn't Louise. Maybe it's the fact that this whole situation shouldn't have happened in the first place." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You're starting to sound like one of the protesters." "Maybe they have a point," Jack shot back, his voice sharper than he intended. "Have you seen what's in those council documents? This isn't just about her house, it's about targeting a community." The chief sighed heavily, leaning against the desk. "I get it, Taylor. Believe me, I do. But we're not politicians. We're cops. Our job is to keep the peace, not to fix decades of bad policy." Jack opened his mouth to argue, but the chief held up a hand. "Enough. Go home, get some rest. We'll deal with this in the morning." Jack hesitated, but he knew there was no point in pushing further. He nodded reluctantly and headed for the door. Outside, the crowd parted slightly as he stepped onto the sidewalk, their chants washing over him like a wave. He felt their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and distrust. He was part of the system they were fighting against, whether he liked it or not. As he walked to his car, his mind raced. The documents, Louise's words, the councilman's icy gaze, it all pointed to something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. Jack knew he was at a crossroads. He could keep his head down and do what was expected of him, or he could start asking questions that no one wanted to answer. And as he drove home, the weight of that choice sat heavily on his chest, refusing to let him rest. The night was restless for Jack. Sleep never came, and he found himself pacing his small apartment, replaying every moment of the day. The protests, Louise's arrest, the councilman's chilling presence, it all swirled together in his mind, creating a storm he couldn't escape. By the time dawn began to creep through his windows, Jack was no closer to clarity. Instead, he felt the pull of something urgent, a need to act even though he didn't yet know what that action should be. Back at the station, the mood was even more tense than the day before. The protesters hadn't left. If anything, their numbers had grown. News crews had set up outside, their cameras capturing every chant, every tear-streaked face, every raised sign demanding justice for Louise. The town's small police force was overwhelmed, not just by the sheer size of the crowd but by the weight of what it represented. Jack arrived to find the station buzzing with activity. Officers shuffled papers and muttered anxiously, their nerves frayed. Chief Reynolds was barking orders, his voice sharp and clipped, but even he couldn't hide the cracks in his composure. Jack's presence was barely acknowledged as he made his way to his desk, but he didn't mind. He had a plan forming, though it was barely more than a whisper in his mind. He needed to see Louise again. When he approached her cell, she was sitting quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her calm demeanor was unchanged, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Jack hesitated, leaning against the bars. "You've got the whole town outside for you," he said, his voice soft but heavy. "Did you expect it to get this big?" Louise looked up at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I didn't expect anything, Officer Taylor. But I hoped. Hope's a funny thing, it's small, but it grows." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I looked through the council records. What they've been doing. It's not right." "No, it's not," Louise agreed, her voice steady. "But that's how power works, isn't it? They chip away at you bit by bit, hoping you'll get tired and give up." Jack leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I want to help. I don't know how yet, but I can't keep pretending this is okay." For the first time, Louise's expression softened into something like gratitude. "Then you've already done the hardest part, son. You've opened your eyes." Before Jack could respond, a loud commotion erupted from the lobby. Shouts echoed through the station, followed by the unmistakable clamor of a crowd surging forward. Jack rushed toward the noise, his heart pounding. He arrived to find the protesters had pushed their way into the building, their chants filling the air. Officers scrambled to hold them back, forming a human barrier between the crowd and the rest of the station. At the center of the chaos stood Richard Hargrove, his presence commanding. He raised his hands, calling for quiet, and the crowd reluctantly settled. His voice rang out, clear and firm. "We're not leaving until Louise Carter is released," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "This isn't just about one woman, this is about all of us. And we won't let this injustice stand." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy palpable. Jack's chest tightened as he looked around, seeing the desperation and determination on their faces. He knew this moment was teetering on the edge, one spark away from becoming something uncontrollable. Chief Reynolds stepped forward, his face drawn and pale. "This isn't the way to handle this," he said, his voice strained but authoritative. "We're following the law, and we need everyone to remain calm." But the crowd wasn't interested in calm. They surged forward again, their voices rising in unison. Jack's eyes darted to the news cameras, capturing every second of the escalating tension. This was a moment the town wouldn't forget, no matter how it ended. Amid the chaos, Jack felt a hand on his arm. He turned to see Richard beside him, his expression intense. "This is your chance, Officer Taylor," he said. "You know this isn't right. Do something." Jack froze, his mind racing. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, every decision feeling impossibly heavy. He looked at the crowd, then back at Richard, and finally toward Louise's cell. The world seemed to narrow, everything else fading into the background. The choice was his, and he knew there was no turning back. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and urgency. He could feel every gaze in the room, even those not directly on him. The station was no longer a place of order, it had become a boiling point, a space where anger, fear, and hope collided in an overwhelming storm. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind teetering between the life he had known and the decision staring him in the face. Richard's words echoed in his ears. Do something. But what? What could he, one officer, realistically do to untangle this mess? Yet deep down, Jack knew the answer. It wasn't about untangling anything. It was about making a stand, even if that stand felt impossible. Before he could speak, Chief Reynolds' voice boomed across the room, cutting through the tension. "Everyone needs to back away. If you don't clear out, we'll have no choice but to make arrests." The chief's words were met with defiance. The protesters surged forward again, their voices rising in a chaotic crescendo. Signs waved above the sea of people, their messages sharp and pointed: justice for Louise. End the land grab. Stop the corruption. Jack's pulse quickened as he scanned the crowd, searching for some kind of